Last time I gave this talk here was a little over 5 years ago, so should be new to everyone. Yeah, back in 2017. Yeah. Sweet. It's not raining. They were predicting rain early in the week that it's going to be raining today. Boy, this is great. Yeah. My fig bushes are budding. Yeah, well, not good because if we get a, that's what happened last year. They budded early, and then we had that cold spell, and I had 2 figs. That was it. And they were about this big. The birds came in about a week ago. The birds came in and stripped every holly berry off 2 of my holly trees. Yeah, I mean, well, we've noted that the robins love holly berries, and so I mean, there must have been 200 or 300 birds in the tree. The whole tree was alive with birds, and they stripped every berry off. but on the other side of the house are 2 other holly trees, untouched. Oh, yeah. Gray colored? Yeah. Yeah, those are the gray squirrels are replacing the fox squirrels down here. Yeah. Yeah. The only one I've seen in recent months was just on the 15501, just north of the entrance to Pinehurst Trace there, dead in the middle of the road. Yeah. Yeah. That's why they're there. Oh, yeah. So switch to daffodils. They won't eat daffodils. Yeah. 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 They have nothing eating our rhododendron. Well, yeah. The reason why they won't eat daffodil bulbs are deadly. Roman soldiers used to carry a couple of daffodil bulbs, so that if they were wounded and it was unlikely that they would eat the bulb to help hasten death. So the deer and the squirrels are smart. They don't eat the daffodil. But if you plant tulips are totally different. Tulips are like deer ice cream. Up north, if you start to feed the deer in the fall with corn, you have to continue it because normally what happens in deer is as their usual grazing food disappears out in the wild, the organisms in their gut gradually change so that in the winter they can eat bark and things like that and digest it. But if you start feeding them corn, they won't switch over to that. And then if you stop feeding corn because there's too much snow on the ground, they'll die. Because their guts won't change the bacteria over to digesting bark and things like that before they starve to death. So once you commit yourself to corn, you're stuck for the winter. That's right. Hey, no, no pickleball today? No pickleball today? Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, that's yeah. I thought it was every week. Yeah. Oh, speaking of which, how do I access these on YouTube? Okay, great. Yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah, because some friends up north would like to look at them. Yeah, I guess we can get started. Okay, thank you. Get close enough here. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. I'm sitting down this week, so we don't have anything like last week. This is, let me get my pointer here. The question is, do you know the name of the woman who was the only female physician in the Union Army and the only woman to be awarded the Medal of Honor to date? And the person is Mary Walker, also known as the Little Lady in Pants. Now, I'm not going to start talking about Mary just yet. Instead, I'm going to talk about Mrs. Bradwell. Turn this a little bit so make sure I'm on the correct slide. Mary was a little strange, and she became involved with women's rights movement after the Civil War. And in her time in Washington, she undoubtedly pressed many people as being eccentric, bluntly forward, nettlesome, demanding, out of place, or even irrational. The terms paranoia and feminism had not yet been invented. She did not conform to what men felt was the appropriate behavior for women. And because she was such an outlier in her behavior, it was easy for men to ignore her and not do what she was seeking or demanding. But I suspect that many women in Washington identified with Mary, but were too oppressed by society at the time to openly support her. So I'm going to use Myra Bradwell as an example of the attitude of the times that today we would consider almost unthinkable. Myra Colby Bradwell came from a family of Revolutionary War patriots. Her parents were prominent in the anti-slavery movement in Illinois, and she was intellectually gifted and started to read for the law, just like Elmer Ellsworth did. Remember, there are no law schools at the time. She did this following her marriage to a young attorney, James Bradwell. She was 38 years old when she took the Illinois bar exam and passed with the highest honors. With her husband's help, she founded and operated the Chicago Legal News, which was the major legal journal of the day for decades. And she ran that pretty much by herself. Although she had passed the bar in Illinois, you also needed a license to practice in Illinois. And her application for a license was twice denied by the Illinois Supreme Court. The first time by, quote, by reason of the disability imposed by your married condition, unquote. And when that logic was challenged and questioned on appeal, she lost her second appeal simply because she was a woman. Myra then appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and the country pretty much treated her case as a comedy. If you saw the, I guess it was made for TV movie about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she uses Myra Bradwell in her case before, not the Supreme Court, but the it was a lower court in the case of the man she was representing, who was a nurse for his dying mother, I believe it was, and he was not going to be paid because he was male acting as a nurse, kind of like the opposite of what was expected in the times. The state of Illinois considered the case such a foregone conclusion that when oral arguments were heard before the Supreme Court 150 years ago this year, 1873, it did not even send an attorney to argue the case. Most considered that if she won the case, it would only be because all 9 justices went insane. The vote was 8-1 against Myra, with the majority declaring in rather derogatory language that the idea of a married woman taking on a career independent of her marital duties was, quote, repugnant, unquote, and must be resisted. This is from the decision, quote, the paramount destiny and mission of woman are to fulfill the noble and benign offices of wife and mother. This is the law of the Creator, unquote. The dissenting vote was the Chief Justice, Salmon P. Chase, who had been Lincoln's Secretary of Treasury. So that gives you an idea of the attitudes of the times regarding the role of women. Now we can start talking a little bit about Mary. The Walker family was a 17th century New England family that settled in the Connecticut River Valley. In 1817, her father, Alva Walker, headed west, traveled, kept a diary, and returned 3 years later. He had exposed himself to different thoughts and philosophies, and he brought these back east with him. Within 3 months, he announced his intentions to marry Vesta Whitcomb. Her family also had been a long New England family with ancestors in the French and Indian Wars and in the American Revolution. They settled in Syracuse, New York, on the then being constructed Erie Canal. Here's a picture. Let's try it again. Hey, Ron, we're not advancing again. There's something about this space and remotes, I guess. Maybe turn it to, I don't know if we... Yeah, okay, let's try that. Well, Ron is playing with that. This is his remote, so that's why he's trying to get this to work. And Lynn says she ordered one that will be here next week, a brand new one that may also not work. We'll find out. Anyway, Syracuse was a new town on the then being constructed. Oh, that worked. Okay. All right. Yeah, I'll just keep this aimed. Sure. Syracuse was a new town on the Erie Canal being constructed at that point, so the family settled there. Their first child died several days after birth. A year later, their second child, Vesta, was born, and she was followed by Aurora, Luna, and Cynthia. After 10 years, the family left Syracuse for a 33-acre farm on the Bunker Hill Road in Oswego town, just outside the village of Oswego, New York, which was on the lake. And Oswego, at that point in time, was one of the boom towns in the United States. Let's see if I can use the pointer here. Erie Canal, black line. Syracuse is right about here. Oswego is right here. The Oswego River flows into Lake Ontario, and the Oswego Canal was built connecting Lake Ontario to the Erie Canal. And that's why Oswego was a boom town and why the family moved there. It had a population in 1848 of about 11,000. Now, Elva, her father, was a progressive farmer and a carpenter, and he built the first schoolhouse in the county at his own expense. Mary was born in Oswego town a few months after the family arrived there on November 26, 1832. This is just an enlarged map of the canal and the route. Oops. No, we missed the picture of Mary. Okay, sorry about that. She was born there in 1832 and was the sixth child in the family. And she was named after her father's maiden sister, Mary Edwards. Elva's on the farm, because they were all girls, the girls pretty much carried out all the usual activities that ordinarily boys would carry out as far as their chores. Mary was described as possessing a restless, nervous energy as a child. Today, a school district might have labeled her ADHD. We don't know. The home reflected the convictions of her much-traveled father, including the belief that girls should be educated and encouraged to pursue professional careers, such as teaching. Elva also stressed the importance of good health, diet, and exercise. Her parents believed that girls should not wear the tight-fitting clothing of the day, like corsets and the long, heavy dresses and long skirts, which they felt would restrict breathing as well as movement. Elva was also concerned about his own health and bought and read books on medicine. Mary later recalled that she became interested in medicine because she read many of her father's books, thumbed through them. Mary received a common school education in the one-room schoolhouse that her father had built next to their home, while her older sisters, Luna and Aurora, attended Faley Seminary in Fulton, New York. This was not a religious seminary, but just a school beyond the one-room schoolhouse. Their interest in their studies also influenced Mary. She also grew up at a time in particular in New York State, but throughout the Northeast, where there were new isms and philosophies arising, in particular things like spiritualism, abolitionism, and temperance. The first women's rights convention was held in find it here. Seneca Falls, New York, 1848. Amelia Bloomer and Elizabeth Smith Miller, the daughter of the famous abolitionist Gerrit Smith, were leading advocates of the Bloomerite movement. That was the Bloomerite movement. Leg coverings, but with skirts that didn't drag along the ground. And they frequently visited Oswego, and Mary saw them and attended some of their talks. The Bloomerite movement was sweeping through New York State at that time. Mary attended Faley Seminary for 2 winter terms of 14 weeks each, beginning in 1850. And at age 19, she left the seminary to take a teaching position in the village of Minetto, which was just about 5 miles from where her home was. In the several years that she taught, her plans crystallized, and she decided that she would become a physician. Now, the nation's rapid growth in population and expansion westward could not easily be matched by the comparable growth of the number of doctors. And so a number of states established, or the medical associations in those states established a number of medical schools to turn out more physicians. These were chartered by the states or the medical societies, and there was such a desperate need for physicians that some schools even accepted women. Elizabeth Blackwell is the first female physician in the United States, graduating from Geneva Medical School in Geneva, New York in 1847. Now, Mary was admitted to Syracuse Medical College in December of 1853, just after her 21st birthday. The school had opened 2 years earlier and had a faculty of 9 practicing physicians and a course of instruction that consisted of 3 13-week terms with clinical practice with one of the physicians in between terms. Now, this was by far not the shortest training offered, but it likewise was by far not the longest. Tuition was $55 a term. Board and room were $1.50 a week. The college was identified as an eclectic institution. Now, there were what was considered orthodox medicine at the time was medicine that believed in the concept that disease was due to an imbalance of 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And this had been the concept of disease for almost 15 centuries, actually. There were new schools arising, new thoughts arising, and one of them was the eclectic school. Another one was the allopathic school. Now, the type of medicine we practice today is allopathic medicine. Allopathic medicine was described in what was considered a non-orthodox type of medicine back in the 1850s. If you had a disease, you treated the disease with medications that had the opposite effect that the disease had. Now, that meant that if you had a high fever, you treated with medications that lowered the fever. If you have a high blood cholesterol, you're given medications to lower your blood cholesterol. That's allopathic medicine. Eclectic medicine, the philosophy of the school where Mary went, didn't believe in the orthodox methods of treatment, which primarily consisted of bleeding, purging, that is, taking medications that made you vomit or have diarrhea to flush out poisons that way, or blistering, medications that blistered the skin in the belief that you drew what was causing the disease to the skin and disposed of toxins that way. The eclectics did not believe in that type of treatment, but they didn't have any specific treatments of their own, and so they kind of pick and chose from the various philosophies of medical practice what the eclectic school felt best fit their particular philosophy. So it was kind of like a little bit here, and we'll take a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But the principle, as proclaimed by eclectic schools, was that, quote, "Nothing should be used as a remedy that will injure the human condition, and that all means used should have a direct tendency to sustain and not depress the vital powers, which is actually a pretty good philosophy to use. Physician, do no harm. So that was the background behind Mary's training. She attended the winter and spring terms of 1853 to 54 and the winter term of 54 to 55, and received instructions in the usual topics that were taught in medical schools: anatomy, surgery, pathology, physiology, pharmacy, chemistry, obstetrics, diseases of women and children, and even medical jurisprudence. She graduated with honors and received a medical degree in June of 1855, the only woman in her class, and I believe she was the first woman to graduate from Syracuse Medical College, and became one of literally a handful of female practitioners in the nation at the time. She started her practice in Columbus, Ohio, but after several months realized that Ohioans were reluctant to be treated by a woman physician. And so her practice was not thriving, and she moved to Rome, came back to New York State, moved to Rome, New York, which is kind of in the central portion of the state, probably about 30 miles from Syracuse, and joined a more successful practice there. Now, in medical school, Mary had met Albert Miller. He was a fellow classmate, a gifted scholar, and orator. He cut a dashing figure at school, and for both, it appeared to be love at first sight. They parted after graduation, and Albert had established a practice in Rome, New York. When Mary went off to Ohio, it was Albert's proposal of marriage, as well as joining him in a common medical practice, which ended her real stay in Columbus. During her medical training, Mary experimented with her dress, taking a page from the Bloomerite movement. She did this, she said, primarily to simplify it and to make it more practical garb for her profession. She adopted then a variation of the bloomer fad. But at the wedding, the bride appeared in trousers and a dress coat. The bride's obligation to obey her husband was dropped from the ceremony, and Mary insisted upon retaining her maiden name, only occasionally signing her name as Dr. Mary Miller-Walker. So Mary pretty much started from the beginning about maintaining her identity. At the onset of the marriage, Mary appeared to have been an affectionate wife, and the union of the two had the outward appearance of a good marriage. But then she began to receive reports of Albert's infidelity. She confronted him. He admitted to the charge. Mary asked him to leave, and she sought a divorce. Albert closed his portion of the practice in 1859 and left Rome, and he disappears from history. I've tried tracking him down, but it's too common a name to really track. Mary moved to a smaller office and concentrated on medicine more seriously than any other time in her life. In the late summer of 1860, she went to Iowa for an Iowa divorce. The reason for that was in Iowa, adultery was a legal grounds for divorce, not in New York State. She lived a few months with friends in Iowa and then returned to Rome in May of 1861, but still not divorced. She then initiated action for divorce in New York State, which was changing its laws at that point, and secured a favorable decision in the Supreme Court of Madison County, but the decree was never finalized. And it actually wouldn't be until 1869, after the Civil War, after a special act of the New York State Legislature to modify the statute of limitations for filing for divorce, because she was in the military, that she was finally legally declared free of her estranged husband. Now, during the busy time in her life between 1855 and 1861, Mary's writing career began on January 1st, 1857, with a letter to Sibyl, a new women's magazine. The editor of the magazine was Dr. Lydia Sayer, who was also a female physician, a journalist, and a dress reformer. And she had married the publisher, John Hasbrook. Sayre becomes a national leader in dress reform, temperance, and women's suffrage for the next 50 years. Mary was one of the original subscribers to the magazine, and then began sending in regular letters to the editor in the magazine. In December 1857, she launched her career as a lecturer, speaking on dress reform, and then issues the basic to women's rights. Because of this, she was elected as one of the vice presidents of the National Dress Reform Association, and spoke out on dress reform, and even spoke out in regards to the Dan Sickles Barton Key scandal and murder in Washington. Now, how many in the audience know a little bit about Dan Sickles Barton Key scandal? Okay, let me give you a little background, because this is interesting. Dan Sickles, a New York politician, senator, becomes a senator for New York State. Sickles is a womanizer and somewhat unscrupulous. He eventually will command 3rd Corps in the Union Army, in the Army of the Potomac, and at Gettysburg, he will defy the repeated orders from Meade, the commander of the Union Army, to stay in position. Instead, Dan wants to move 3rd Corps forward to an area known as the Peach Orchard because he figures it as a better position for his corps to defend. When he does that, he leaves a gap in the Union line and moves 3rd Corps forward as a salient. And the area that he is defending is substantial, and 3rd Corps is the smallest corps in the Union Army at the time. He moves forward just as what is known as Longstreet's charge on the 2nd day of July, which strikes 3rd Corps, and 3rd Corps will be decimated because of the position that they're in, and Dan will lose his leg in that battle when a cannonball hits him and his horse, almost severing the leg just below the knee. Dan has some redeeming characters. He rallies his men, but once it appears that the corps commander has been killed, what's left of the corps is beginning to break from its position, but Dan pulls out a cigar, and he has his staff carry him off on a stretcher, rallying the men, and the men hold a little bit better. Dan will send one of his sergeants back to recover the leg, and he wanted the specific cannonball. Well, the sergeant recovered the leg, which the physician amputated right on the field there where Dan was wounded. But I suspect he probably grabbed any cannonball he could find rather than look around for the specific cannonball. Dan will return to Washington 2 days after the battle, and he will arrive in Washington with news of the battle, which he will report to President Lincoln directly. Dan is a Democrat, but he's a war Democrat. And Lincoln needs war Democrats as opposed to the peace Democrats who are advocating a settlement with the Confederacy. Let's end this war now and let them have their slavery and let them leave the country. So Lincoln has supported Dan Sickles. Well, the message Dan brings back to Lincoln is, I saved Gettysburg by moving 3rd Corps forward. I disrupted Longstreet's charge, and there aren't many people to counter that because Meade is sending information back to the War Department regarding Pickett's charge and what happens over the next several days, but Dan has got the president's ear. Later, Dan will, when he has a dinner party, will take all the gentlemen after dinner. He's paid the watchman at the medical museum, National Medical Museum, where his leg and cannonball are on display, and he takes them down there and regales them with stories of how he saved Gettysburg. So that gives you a little bit of the kind of character that Dan is. Well, prior to the Civil War, Dan was living with an Italian professor in Washington, renting a room in the house, and he was helping the professor's children learn English, and they were helping him learn Italian. Dan is about 35, 40 years old at the time, and the family's 16-year-old daughter falls in love with Dan, and Dan will subsequently marry her. So there's about a 15-year difference, 15 plus difference in their ages. Dan will by now he's senator from New York State, living in Washington. He has a house on Lafayette Square near the White House, and Dan keeps his wife at home while he's carrying on 3 simultaneous affairs: 2 with women in Washington and 1 with a woman in Baltimore. And everyone knows about this, but that's okay behavior for men at the time. His wife was lonely, and Dan decides to introduce at a party his wife to Barton Key, Philip Barton Key. Barton Key is the son of Francis Scott Key, who writes the Star Spangled Banner, and he is the district attorney in Washington, D.C. He's young, handsome, and Dan himself introduces his wife to him in the belief that they're 2 young people. They'll have some common things to talk about, and my wife will be distracted from my affairs, type of thing. Well, they fall in love, and they start to have their own secret affair. And Dan finds out about this, and Dan will, in the front of Lafayette Square, when Barton Key is behind a tree waiting for the signal from Dan's wife from their house that he's left the house and it's a time for them to get together. So Barton is waiting there. Dan has scouted this out, and Dan comes up to him with 2 pistols, and in front of people, this is in the mid-morning, shoots Barton Key in the groin. The bullet severs the femoral artery and femoral vein, so he's bleeding to death there. The second single-shot pistol, Dan puts the Barton Key's head, pulls the trigger, but the gun doesn't go off. So, but Barton will die about 10:50. He's taken to a nearby home, and before a doctor can get there to do anything, he will die. Dan is arrested, put in jail, but he's a senator with good political connections, and a chef brings him meals in jail. His friends come over pretty much every day and with wine, and they even had a candelabra in the cell, so they had dinner and wine. And he will hire the dream team of the 19th century to defend him in court. The dream team will be headed by Henry Stanton, who is Secretary of War. This is before the Civil War. And there are 7 lawyers in the team. One of them is Francis Bahar, who will later command the Irish Brigade. The case is going to be prosecuted by the assistant district attorney because Barton Key is dead. He was the district attorney. As an assistant district attorney, he has never tried a capital case. So it's not a good time for him to win his first case. And Stanton will come forward with the concept of temporary insanity defense. And this is the first time in the American legal system that temporary insanity is a defense, and he will get off. So that's the background behind the charge and what Mary is arguing about. She considered the reporting in the press obviously biased, because it implied that a female's vice was more reprehensible than a male's. Dan's friends expected him to divorce his wife because she was carrying on the affair. But Dan surprises them, and he does not divorce his wife. And in fact, he moves her out of Washington up to New York City, and he will stay married to her. After the war, Dan will be given the position as ambassador to Spain. He will then have an affair with the Queen Mother of Spain, which kind of disrupts some of the relationships between the United States and Spain. But Dan has some other positive redeeming features. If you've ever been to New York City and you go to Central Park exists because of Dan Sickles. Dan was able to organize, there were many attempts to preserve land in Manhattan, which was rapidly filling up to maintain it as part of the natural environment there. But no one could really get the New York State Legislature to act upon this. But Dan was successful in doing that. And so Central Park exists because of Dan Sickles. Also, if you've been to Gettysburg, to a great extent, the National Park at Gettysburg is the result of Dan Sickles' involvement. Because he was the hero of Gettysburg, just ask him, he initiated legislation to allow the federal government to buy large portions of land that was battle land at Gettysburg. And so the basis of the National Park at Gettysburg comes about because of Dan's involvement in that, in pushing that through Congress. But Dan also has to kind of put his own twist in. The fence that surrounds the park, Lafayette Park, where he assassinated Barton Key, is a wrought iron fence. And if you go to Gettysburg today and you go to the National Cemetery, there's a wrought iron fence that surrounds the cemetery. Dan had a section of the original fence where he shot Barton Key removed and transported to Gettysburg. And there's a section of fence which the park rangers will show you that is the portion of the fence brought from Washington D.C. at Dan's request, and the rest of the fence was made in its image. So he has a strange, interesting man. Sometime we'll do a full presentation on him. Getting back to Mary, the Civil War. That's right. Yeah. The Civil War created a demand for physicians and surgeons. And so in October of 1861, Mary left her practice in Rome and went to Washington and applied for a commission as an assistant surgeon in the Army. And she goes into the office of the then Surgeon General, who was in his mid-80s, General Finley. And Finley is shocked by this because he felt that he never even considered the concept that a woman would seek a position as a physician in the Union Army. So he immediately turns that down. But Mary, to make herself useful, goes to she volunteers as a physician in one of the hospitals that surround Washington. This is about the time that Ellsworth is in Washington. This is before the Battle of First Manassas. Remember that Ellsworth's fire swaths were put up in the House of Representatives because there was no place to put them. Some of the Indiana regiments are put up at the Patent Office, and the Patent Office now becomes known as the Indiana Hospital. Dr. J.N. Green is the physician in charge there, and Mary goes to him and volunteers her services. And Greene is impressed by not only her references, but her efforts in helping him treat primarily ill soldiers at the hospital. Greene writes a letter of recommendation for Mary, which he takes to the new Surgeon General, who is now Hammond, and even to the Assistant Surgeon General. But again, she's not granted a commission. Nonetheless, she relishes her duties at the Indiana hospital. She makes rounds, meets ambulances, prescribes medication, and helps determine appropriate treatments. Quoting from her notes, Mary kept an extensive diary throughout the entire war, and that will be important. Quote, every soul in the hospital has to abide by my orders as much as though Dr. Greene gave them, unquote. She functions as a hospital administrator, a therapist, a counselor, an expediter and confessor, a letter writer, and a mother substitute for these young men there. When Mary heard stories of the debtor's prison in Alexandria, she gained admission by announcing to the guards, I am Dr. Walker of the Union Army. I command to let me pass. Let me pass. And these soldiers, she's now dressing in the garb of a Union surgeon, including the green sash, and so then they let her pass. She interviews a number of soldiers there and is convinced that some of them are unjustly confined there. And in one particular case, with no concern for protocol, she goes directly to the War Office, barges into Secretary of War Stanton's office, and presents the case to him, and she secures a pardon for one of the prisoners in the deserters' prison. The word of that quickly spreads, and now hundreds of families who have had their sons or male relatives either in deserters' prisons or in the Army, that the young son lied about his age and got drafted, not drafted, but volunteered, and now the family is looking for a release of them. So Mary gets involved with that whole process. In early 1862, she leaves the patent office, Indiana Hospital, and goes back to New York City to qualify for a second medical diploma at the Hygeia Therapeutic College. Not unusual for a physician to attend 2 or even 3 medical schools and have a degree from 3 different schools at the time. Instructions included lectures and clinics at Bellevue Hospital. And in March 31st, 1862, she departs with her second medical degree. In October, she returns to Oswego and gives a series of lectures and writes articles on dress reform. All during this time, she is wearing the same type of clothing that she had put together when she was a medical student, this bloomerite type of clothing. Comfortable, convenient, but also obviously conspicuous. In November 1862, she's at the headquarters of General Burnside near Warrenton, Virginia. At this point, she's had made for her blue officer's uniform, pants with kind of like the bloomerite movement, a longer jacket, pants with a gold stripe down it. Down the leg, and the green sash of the surgeon. She had heard that there was an outbreak of typhoid fever there, and that there were inadequate staff as well as medications to treat the typhoid fever. So she barges into Burnside's office and urges him to move the sick men to Washington, where hospitals are present and where there are more medical staff and supplies. Burnside, agrees, gives her a note, and she immediately then goes out and commandeers a train and loads the train with sick and wounded soldiers as well as some civilians, and it takes that to Washington. These are just some of the incidents that Mary goes through. Every day is something different with Mary like this, but these are just some of the more notable ones. She follows Burnside's army to Fredericksburg in December of 1862, where the Union Army suffered one of its worst defeats, and she helped treat some of the 13,000 casualties. Dr. Preston King, who worked with Mary at Fredericksburg, presented to the Secretary of War an account of her volunteer work and the use of personal funds to buy supplies for the soldiers. But she receives neither reimbursement nor a commission. During early part of 1863, she visited hospitals in Washington, gathered a list of the wounded from the Oswego area where her family was from, and began communicating reports between Washington and Oswego. She's instrumental in organizing the Women's Relief Association and ran a very successful fundraising drive and opened a house in Washington, D.C. She rented a house for unprotected females and children who are frequently found about the streets of Washington without friends, money, or home. Families may have gotten a piece of mail from their male relative that they were wounded and are in a hospital in Washington, and then they heard nothing further. So it would not be unusual for a family to travel to Washington to try and find which one of the hospitals their wounded person is in. And of course, Washington has the population of Washington has increased dramatically. There are no places available for them to stay. They're sleeping in the streets. So Mary does a little practicing on the side, takes the money, rents a house, and makes this available to families to live in. And she pays for this out of her own funds. In her many references to war experiences in the extensive diary that she kept, she never refers specifically to performing major surgery. She was convinced, and as part of her eclectic training, that surgeons often were amputating unnecessarily, and she would sometimes scheme with soldiers whom she felt did not require amputation to have them refuse to submit to surgery. Although she was as outspoken as she was, there are no indications that she actually ever confronted the surgeon directly, but worked through the soldier. Now, one of the most colorful portrayals of her wartime appearance appeared in the New York Tribune. Reporters described her, quote, among the unmarshaled host of camp followers of the Army, not the least noteworthy personage is Miss Mary E. Walker, or Dr. Walker, as she is usually styled. Dressed in male habiliments, with the exception of a girlish-looking straw hat decked off with an ostrich feather, and with a petite figure and feminine features, the tout ensemble is quite engaging. Her reputation is unsullied, and she carries herself amid the camp with a jaunty air of dignity, well calculated to receive the sincere respect of the soldiers. She can amputate a limb with the skill of an old surgeon and administer medicine equally as well. Strange to say that, although she has frequently applied for a permanent position in the medical corps, she has never been formally assigned to any particular duty. We will add that the lady referred to is exceedingly popular among the soldiers in the hospital and is undoubtedly doing much good, unquote. In January of 1864, she writes directly to Lincoln, telling him of her volunteer services as an acting assistant surgeon in Washington and her inability to obtain a commission solely on account of her sex. She asks Lincoln if he would assign her to duty at Douglas Hospital in the female ward, but with orders to go whenever there's a major battle, to leave that ward and go and render aid in the field where, quote, she's writing about herself in the third person. Her energy, enthusiasm, professional ability and patriotism will be of the greatest service in inspiring the true soldier never to yield to traitors and in attending the wounded brave, unquote. In less than a week, Lincoln replied in his own handwriting at the bottom of Mary's letter. And the letter itself is actually in the Historical Society in Oswego. Quote, this is Lincoln's response. The medical department of the Army is an organized system in the hands of men supposed to be learned in the profession. and I'm sure it would injure the service for me with strong hand to thrust among them anyone, male or female, against their consent. If they are willing for Dr. Mary Walker to have charge of a female ward, if there be one, I also am willing, but I am sure controversy on the subject will not subserve the public interest. A. Lincoln, January 16, 1864. Now, about this same time, one of her congressmen from upstate New York, Congressman Farnsworth, writes a letter to the Surgeon General on Walker's behalf. He concluded, I hope you will give her some good position where she can properly support herself and at the same time be most useful, unquote. She's authorized to report to Chattanooga, Tennessee. Now, fate was on Mary's side at this point, for the assistant surgeon of the 52nd Ohio Regiment suddenly had died that January at Chattanooga, and a replacement assistant surgeon was needed. On March 8th, 1864, she was ordered to report to the Assistant Surgeon General at Chattanooga and meet with the Board of Medical Officers. The medical director of the Army of the Cumberland, Dr. Perrin, was resolved that the sick and wounded under his command should not be trusted to what he called a, quote, medical monstrosity, unquote. And he ordered a medical board to examine her qualifications. The board found that she was so inadequate, quote, as to render it doubtful whether she had pursued the study of medicine, unquote. However, given the circumstances of the board review, this was probably a foregone conclusion. Years later, when Mary's on tour in England, she denied that she ever appeared before such a board. Now, it's unlikely that she could have forgotten that as a humiliating experience, but her denial may have been an attempt to kind of dodge what she considered was basically a kangaroo court. Despite Perrin's report, General George H. Thomas, I want to comment on this first. This is a picture in the highly accurate Wikipedia showing supposedly a picture of Mary in front of a tent with the 52nd Ohio. The tent says Headquarters Post Office, and the woman is about the height of Mary Walker. She has some facial characteristics that are similar to Walker, but she's wearing the typical dress of the time. Mary would never be caught in this type of dress. If that were truly Mary Walker, I think standing there, she would have been in her bloomerite type of clothing. So this is probably the postmistress for the post office, the headquarters post office, rather than Mary. Since the 52nd Ohio was in winter quarters, she began to treat the sick and civilian families in the area. She passed through the picket lines daily and roamed far and wide to make sick calls. She brought Army medical supplies to many families, and many of the soldiers questioned whether she was really a spy. Years later, when questioned about her service, which had won her the Medal of Honor, she pointed to her work with the destitute civilians near Chattanooga. Quote, the special valor was for going into the enemy's ground when the inhabitants were suffering for professional services and sent to our lines to beg assistance, and no man surgeon was willing to respond for fear of being taken prisoner. And by my doing so, the people were won over to the Union, unquote. Well, on April 10th, 1864, while on one of her expeditions, Mary took a wrong turn and was taken prisoner by a Confederate sentry. She was delivered to D.H. Hill, and he in turn conveyed Mary to General Joe Johnston. She remained at his headquarters for a week. Callers included several medical officers who came to question her as to ascertain whether a woman was really qualified to be a physician. She was next taken to Dalton, Georgia, and transported by train to Richmond. News that a Yankee lady physician in bloomers aboard the train preceded the train by telegraph, and crowds turned out in droves at the various train stops. In Richmond, Mary was confined at Castle Thunder, a political prison that had been a tobacco warehouse prior to the war. She retained her bloomers and endured the filth, scant rancid food, vermin, and humid heat through the summer. The Richmond Examiner reported that she did not like her quarters and wished to go home. Quote, she spent her confinement not in reading medical works, but devouring all the novel nonsense and trash she could get a hold of with a Negro character in them, unquote. It also was reported that she would not exchange her boomer outfit for one, quote, more becoming to her sex, unquote. She had offered to treat the sick in the prison, but her offer was refused because the Confederates didn't trust her. Yeah. No, that's okay. She was released in August 12th, 1864, after 4 months of imprisonment. And with several hundred other prisoners, she was placed aboard a flag of truce steamer and taken to Fortress Monroe. She was exchanged as a surgeon for a Southern major, and she never let anyone forget the fact that she was exchanged for a 6-foot-tall major. Mary was now physically weak and had lost considerable weight. She recuperated a few weeks in Washington and then headed to Nashville and General Sherman's front near Atlanta. She visited with her old brigade there. Then in September 1864, there was a windfall payment for the sum of $434.66 for services as a contract physician from March 11th to August 23rd, 1864. Ironically, she had been a prisoner for 4 of the 5 months. This had been initiated by Colonel McCook of the 52nd Ohio. Now, Colonel McCook, you may remember the McCook name. It was McCook who introduced Elmer Ellsworth to Abraham Lincoln, McCook being a friend of Lincoln, and that's how Lincoln and Ellsworth made contact. He had requested the reimbursement, and this was favorably endorsed by General George Thomas. On October 5th, she was officially awarded a contract as acting assistant surgeon, U.S. Army, with a salary of $100 a month. As a female surgeon, she was unique in the annals of the Army and remained on duty in this capacity until the close of the war. Her initial assignment, dated September 1864, was in the Women's Prison Hospital at Louisville, Kentucky. It was not as glamorous as her duties with soldiers, and she soon found herself caught between her superior officers and the female prisoners. Most of her superiors complained that she was too lenient with the prisoners. On the other hand, the prisoners complained about harsh treatment and bad food for Mary Walker, so it's a no-win situation. She defended her strict regulation in regards to disloyal talk, the singing of rebel songs in the prison, and familiarity between prisoners and guards. That's, in case you didn't catch that, that's sex between prisoners and guards. She defended her strict regulations in regards to these, and she wanted the prison kept clean and would not allow prisoners to abuse each other or prisoners to abuse their small children, which were often in prison with their mothers. After 6 months, she requested a transfer, even though the post-medical director greatly praised her efforts. In March of 1865, she was ordered to Nashville and was placed in charge of an orphan asylum and was made responsible for refugee families housed in the area. Her war service officially ended on June 15, 1865, and it's at this point that her extensive diary that she kept ends. Mary returned to Richmond to celebrate July 4th in the Confederate capital. She was one of the principal attractions, resplendent now in her surgeon's uniform on the steps of the Confederate Capitol. And with the undivided attention of the predominant Yankee-supported audience, she read aloud Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Throughout the summer and fall of 1865, Mary wrote President Johnson and Judge Advocate General Holt about securing a post-war commission. Her request was denied on November 2nd, 1865. However, 9 days later, on November 11th, 1865, Congress and President Johnson provided a more formal and climactic military farewell by awarding her the Medal of Honor for meritorious service. This is what the citation reads. Whereas it appears from official reports that Dr. Mary E. Walker, a graduate of medicine, has rendered valuable service to the government, and her efforts have been earnest and untiring in a variety of ways, and that she was assigned to duty and served as an assistant surgeon in charge of female prisoners at Louisville, Kentucky, upon the recommendation of Major Generals Sherman and Thomas, and faithfully served as contract surgeon in the service of the United States, and has devoted herself with much patriotic zeal to the sick and wounded soldiers, both in the field and hospital, to the detriment of her own health, and has endured hardships as a prisoner of war 4 months in a southern prison while acting as a contract surgeon. And whereas by reason of her not being a commissioned officer in the military service, a brevet or honorary rank cannot, under existing laws, be conferred upon her. And whereas in the opinion of the President, an honorable recognition of her services and sufferings should be made, it is ordered that a testimonial thereof shall be hereby made and given to the said Dr. Mary E. Walker, and that the usual Medal of Honor for meritorious services be given to her. Given under my hand in the city of Washington, D.C., this 11th day of November, A.D. 1865, Andrew Johnson, President, Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War. The National Republican newspaper published a copy of the bill along with the article. Quote, this order is handsomely inscribed upon parchment and is the only compensation under the law that the President is empowered to bestow upon the doctor because she happens to be a woman. Much of the service rendered by her to the government could not have been accomplished by a man, unquote. Now, the Civil War years were Mary's most colorful, but for more than a half century afterwards, she strove for a series of lost causes. She practiced medicine sporadically. She blamed deterioration of her vision as a result of her imprisonment in Richmond, and the main reason why she couldn't practice continuously. She tried to have her $8.50 a month pension increased to that of a physician, but the Pension Bureau repeatedly refused. It would not be until 1898 that her monthly pension was increased to $20. She became involved in numerous social issues. Her attentions were first drawn to hundreds of nurses who had served during the war but were denied pensions and other benefits. Mary and her associates had many bills introduced to Congress, only to see them die in committee. She again became involved with the dress reform movement, which she had started before the war, but had temporarily set aside. She again wrote for Sybil magazine about clothing reform. She was arrested in New York City for immodest clothing. The police argued that that the wearing of men's clothing by a woman was an offense. If she dressed in such a manner as to attract a crowd and cause public excitement, she should be arrested. But Mary presented an eloquent defense to the commissioner of police, who agreed that she had a right to wear her pantaloons. He then let her go with the admonition to his policemen to never arrest her again. Her defense: I don't wear men's clothes. I wear my own clothes. The New York Times published a cartoon editorial comparing Mary to ladies with hoop skirts awry in the wind. The caption reads, "Modesty according to law, but this pretty dear is not arrested because she does not violate the public's sense of propriety." Oh no. Here's Mary. Oops. Oh, I guess if you go back to the cartoon, yeah. And one more. Oh no, one more. Okay. Yeah, I think one more. Yeah. Oh, okay. So here's Mary being arrested by the police officer for wearing her own clothes, and opposite are women dressed appropriately for the times with their hoop skirts, but with the wind in this case blowing the skirt up so that it demonstrates the woman's legs. And we know from the Monitor Merrimack presentation last week that the sailors were excited when the women in Washington wanted to see the inside of the ship, and and they got a chance to see women's legs as they came down the ladders, wearing their skirts. Following her defense, she was elected president of the National Dress Reform Association in Syracuse. In September of 1866, Mary was invited to serve as a delegate to the Social Science Congress in Manchester, England. What was to be a vacation and a rest turned into a lecture series after her speech before Congress. She stated that, quote, Great Britain should give equal rights to women. And she went on to predict that the women would earn the right in Great Britain, rights and privileges enjoyed by men within 10 years. Well, Mary was a little bit off in that. It would not be until 1918 that some women in Great Britain were given the right to vote. They had to be more than 30 years of age. They had to be married. They had to either own property or have a guaranteed yearly income of so many pounds. It would take another 10 years to 1928 that all women over the age of 21 were given the right to vote equal to men. But Mary denied the charge that women, when given the right to vote, that they would not use their judgment and would just simply vote as their husbands did. She argued that honest differences between husbands and wives on political issues would enhance rather than undermine family relations. She insisted the wisdom of a vote varied by intelligence. It had nothing to do with the gender of the voter. The combination of dress, personality, and speech captured the imagination of her audiences. They particularly enjoyed the story of her life, her trials in medical school, and as a prisoner female physician. However, she was excoriated by the British medical press. But for over a year, she lectured throughout Britain and Scotland. She was invited to Paris to speak before returning to Washington months later. She began a U.S. speaking tour in 1868, speaking especially on the lack of women's rights. After her lecture tour, Mary completed her first book, a 100-page autobiographical book entitled Hit, H-I-T, which she never explained. The book was filled with her opinions on conjugal companionship, dress reform, health, tobacco, and alcohol, labor, and citizenship. This was followed several years later by her second book entitled Unmasked, or The Science of Immorality. In both books, she addressed a number of social issues. Tobacco was a poison which ruined the digestive system and eventually poisoned every tissue. It produced paralysis and insanity and left its blight on the wife and children of smokers. Wives of smokers suffered nervous exhaustion from the air which tobacco contaminated. She called for greater recognition of workers trying to achieve higher living standards and recognition from the employers against overburdening their employees. She classified men ranging from a Code 1 being a man who truly respected his wife and treated her with the same deference as his honored mother or sister, and noted that this type of man was quite uncommon, to a Code 6, a man who constantly was on the prowl for victims to satiate his sexual drives. Dan Sickles probably would be a 6. In the years immediately following her return from England, Mary devoted her time to supporting women's suffrage when she was not lecturing. She was at the crest of the women's rights movement, living in Washington and appearing on the same platforms as Lucy Stone, Susan B. Anthony, Mary Livermore, and Beva Lockwood. She helped found the Women's Suffrage Association of Ohio and served as a member of the Central Women's Suffrage Bureau, organized in Washington to coordinate activities. She received much press coverage because of her dress and her personality. She spearheaded a voter registration movement in the District of Columbia. And on election day, a large number of women presented themselves to the registration desk but were refused. Mary addressed the throng of men and women, quote, "Gentlemen, these women have assembled to exercise the right of citizens as a profess to be Republican country. And if you debar them of the right to register, you but add new proof that this is a tyrannical government, sustained by force and not by justice. As long as you tax women and deprive them of the right of franchise, you but make yourselves tyrants. You imprison women for crimes you have forbidden women to legislate upon, unquote. The failure to obtain the ballot through mass registration convinced most of the suffragists that success would hinge on an amendment to the Constitution. But Mary disagreed and was soon relegated to the radical fringe of the movement. Now an outsider, she continued to turn up after convention for more than 40 years. Simply put, Mary argued the Constitution already granted women the same rights as men. Efforts should be made to convince Congress of that fact. Any law that discriminated against women was in conflict with the Constitution. And she persisted in this point of view before the New York State Legislature and Congress in Washington, even as the 19th Amendment snowballed on towards victory. Her appearances now before committees of Congress and the New York State Legislature were now identified as hostile in opposition to the amendment. She said, quote, "I am opposed to granting men the right to vote on the rights of women," unquote. They were once friends in the suffrage movement, now counted her as an enemy. In later years, Mary spent more time on her farm near Oswego. She became more and more eccentric. She exalted her virtues and assumed an air of infallibility. She became intolerant of family and friends, and in her paranoia, she felt that people were deliberately trying to thwart her. She wore her Medal of Honor pretty much daily and felt it was her most cherished possession. In 1907, a Medal of Honor replacement was designed and was sent out to all medal recipients. They were to accept the new medal and return the old medal. Mary did not return the old medal, and after that wore both medals of honor. In 1917, the Board of Medal of Honor Awards, while reviewing the merits of Civil War awards, ruled that Mary's was unwarranted. The medal was for valor, and there was nothing in the records to show a specific act upon which the the decoration was awarded. And she was among 911 recipients who were disqualified. The largest group was, I think it was the Maine 27th Regiment. 350 medals in that regiment were disqualified. And that came about, the 27th was an experienced regiment. A battle was expected to occur in the next several days, and their enlistment was up. And the men were clamoring to, we want to go home before this battle because, we've served our 3 years and we don't want to hang around for a battle. The regimental commander went to the Secretary of War, Stanton, and said, can't you do something to keep this regiment here, demand that they stay until this, this battle is over. And Stanton says, their enlistments were up. There was nothing he could do. He says, but tell them if they'll serve another 2 weeks, they'll all get a medal. So the regiment stayed, and 350 of them were given medals of honor. Those were 350 of the 911 medals that were recovered. One to Kit Carson and one to, obviously, given Kit Carson well after the Civil War, and one to Wild Bill Hickok that were also rescinded in that group. She reviewed the highlights of her career for the board, but in 1919, the board still voted to revoke the award. A newspaper reported that, quote, Dr. Walker is the only woman ever to receive the medal, which may also be the reason why she lost it, unquote. Legend has it that she said to the federal authorities who delivered the news that she must surrender the medal, "You can have it over my dead body." And she dies about 2 days later. The 87-year-old physician dies on February 21st, 1919. and she's buried in her family plot in the rural cemetery in Oswego town. Oops. Well, that just went through that. Well, it's just a close-up. That's okay. It's just a close-up of the stone. One of her medals of honor is in the Historical Museum at Oswego, and I believe Mary is buried with the other one. Mary's story doesn't end there. Her name keeps popping up. In World War II, there was a Liberty ship named after her. In 1960, a portrait of her was discovered in the Old Army Medical Museum in Washington. In 1976, Miss Helen Hay Wilson, a grandniece of Mary's, petitioned that the Medal of Honor be restored. And on June 10th, 1977, her Medal of Honor was officially and posthumously restored to her. In 1982, a stamp was issued by the Postal Service commemorating Mary on the 150th anniversary of her birth. The artist chose to represent Mary in a dark Victorian dress with a white collar and some lace. Her hair is done up in a dark corkscrew curl. It's actually based on a physician of Mary that was taken when she was on tour in England. The medical facility at SUNY Oswego was named in her honor, along with the Mary Walker Walt Whitman Clinic in Washington, D.C. In 2002, she was inducted into the Women's Hall of Fame in Seneca Falls, New York. And in May of 2012, a statue was unveiled by the Oswego Town Historical Society. Now, some questions about Mary. Was she truly the only female physician in the Union Army? There was the concept of homosexuality had not yet evolved at the time. So Mary was not considered homosexual. Likewise, she was clearly not a woman disguising herself as a man, as at least 400 women did to serve in the Union Army. Physical exams during the first year of the war, in particular with the volunteer regiments, were so cursory, soldiers never undressed. So it was easily possible for a woman to disguise herself as a man and serve with men. Sometimes because their husband was in the same regiment, but other times because they wanted to be as patriotic as men. So the evidence indicates that at least 400 women served in the Union Army disguised as men. Many felt that what Mary did was just nursing. And this is a painting in the Bridgman Art Library depicting Mary on the battlefield. And again, this is the artist's view of Mary. Mary never looked like that on the battlefield. Okay, she was always in her surgeon's uniform. This is clearly a woman, dressed as a nurse. Mary never recognized herself as a nurse and fought for the acceptance that she was not a nurse. Civil War nurses themselves had their own struggles, but there were enough of them to force the medical department to soften the Army's attitudes towards them. Mary's struggles were carried out almost single-handedly, and whenever she appeared in the field, she was certain to wear the green sash of the surgeon. There were at least 6 other women doctors who took an active part in the war effort. Only 2 left some account of their war experiences, and that's why Walker's extensive documentation of her experiences in what she called incidents connected with the Army, this almost daily diary, was all the more important since it was rare to find a woman physician's account of her participation in the war. Several other female doctors provided nursing services. Oriana Russell Moon graduated from the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania in 1857 and enlisted as a nurse in the medical department of the Confederacy. She then married a physician and worked with him treating wounded, but most likely as a nurse rather than as a physician, since there was no hard evidence to support the claim as a commissioned surgeon. And these are 2 Confederate surgeon accounts describing her. She was a lady of high character and fine intelligence, and although she failed to distinguish herself as a physician, she made an excellent nurse. Unfortunately for her professional prospects, she fell in love with one of our assistant surgeons and devoted herself to the care of her own babies, like a sensible woman. And the other physician wrote, "In my humble judgment, no one possessing a womb or the endowment or endowed with the attributes of femininity ought to dream of entering the ranks of the medical profession." So the Confederates felt as the Union did towards female physicians. In the North, Dr. Chloe Annette Bacall wrote a 32-page letter to the Pension Bureau to support a pension claim. And Dr. Mary Frame Myers Thomas, she and Bacall worked as nurses for the Indiana Sanitary Commission. So they were not in the Army, but the Sanitary Commission. Hetty K. Painter also served as a nurse in several general hospitals. Dr. Esther Hill Hanks, who trained at the New England Female Medical College in Boston, was rejected by both the Army and the Nursing Corps by Dorothea Dix because she was too attractive. Dorothea Dix wanted, as she and this was published in the papers, she was looking for women over age 30, matronly, and women described as handsome. When you describe a woman as handsome, you were describing a woman who was not particularly attractive. And Dorothea Dix, also known as Dragon Dix, was suspicious of good-looking women who wanted to be nurses in the Union Army only to, find a husband. So she rejected attractive women, and that's what happened to Esther Hanks. Esther also kept a diary of her activities, but this was never meant to be read in public, so you can imagine what was in the diary. Dr. Sarah Ann Chedrick Clapp also served as a volunteer assistant surgeon in the 7th Illinois Volunteer Cavalry for 10 months, kind of what Mary did in the first portion of the war. So it appears that Mary, having been granted a commission, was really the only female physician in the Union Army, and probably similar in the Confederate Army, the military in general. Second question, was Mary a spy for the Union Army? Many Southerners believed her engaged in spying activities since she was arrested when she blundered into the Confederate lines. A year after her release from Castle Thunder, the Judge Advocate General stated that Walker, quote, passed frequently beyond our lines, far within those of the enemy, and at one time gained information that led General Sherman to so modify his strategic operations as to save himself from a serious reverse and obtain success where defeat seemed to be inevitable, unquote. When captured, she had no incriminating documents on her, but she seemed to have every intention on spying if given the opportunity. General George Thomas indicated that, quote, she desired to be sent to the 52nd Ohio as assistant acting surgeon so that she might get through our lines and get information on the enemy. I consented to let her go, and she was soon afterwards captured, unquote. A reply from Assistant Adjutant General Townsend implied she was engaged in gathering information. Quote, is there anything due the woman? And if so, what amount for Secret Service and for other services? The object is to give her some funds in her need if anything is due, unquote. And Mary herself, in a letter she wrote to Secretary of War Stanton, made it clear that spying on the enemy was on her agenda. Quote, any Secret Service that your honorable body may wish performed will find in me one eminently fitted to do it, unquote. After the war, the government admitted that Mary wandered outside the lines in accordance with a preconcerted arrangement between her and federal officers, Dr. Walker thinking she might obtain information while in the hands of the enemy, which would be of value to the federal officers, unquote. So it appears, despite what some articles of Wikipedia say, that Mary indeed was also spying for the Union Army. And finally, did Mary Walker deserve to be awarded the Medal of Honor? She certainly didn't earn it for actions on the battlefield or the traditional circumstances for which the award is presently granted. 8 physicians in the Civil War were awarded the Medal of Honor. Some of the medals were awarded to soldiers for political reasons or for sentimental reasons. Of course, the 350 to the 27th Maine. Mary's medal was definitely not awarded to her because it was politically correct to honor a woman in the Civil War. If that were the case, there would be other, perhaps more deserving women in the form of Mother Bickerdike or even Dorothea Dix or Clara Barton, if it was merely to recognize a woman. Judge Advocate General Holt, in his recommendation to President Johnson and Secretary of War Stanton, summed up her service to the military. Quote, "Indeed, in the case of this woman, when her sacrifices, her fearless energy under circumstances of peril, her endurance of hardship and imprisonment at the hand of the enemy, and especially her act of patriotism and eminent loyalty are considered, may well be regarded as an almost isolated one in the history of the rebellion, and to signalize and perpetuate it as such would seem to be desirable." Unquote. In 1977, the Army Board of Corrections reevaluated her qualifications for the medal, and they arrived at a similar conclusion. Quote, "Although there is no one particular act of heroism which is traditionally associated with the award of the Medal of Honor, there is ample evidence to show distinguished gallantry at the risk of life in the face of the enemy, and that such actions were of such a nature and also above and beyond the call of duty. When consideration is given to her total contribution, her acts of gallantry, self-sacrifice, patriotism, dedication, and unflinching loyalty to her country, despite the apparent discrimination because of her sex, the award appears to have been appropriate." And on June 10th, as I said, 1977, the official records regarding Walker's case were corrected. Now, there were many stories about Dr. Walker that were exaggerated or the results of unsubstantiated newspaper stories during the war. The article that she could amputate with the best of old surgeons is a good example. Or that she wore pants because she was too lazy to wash her legs, or that she wore such garments in order to display her legs. Or the story that was by an act of Congress that she was allowed to wear pants during the war. So all those were, some of the things that were unsubstantiated. She was tenacious and persistent. She badgered the Surgeon General's office, and she pushed her way into areas where few would have ventured without orders or support from persons of higher command. She unselfishly took the monies that she earned and bought supplies for the sick and the unfortunate in Washington. She was the proverbial squeaky wheel, and her attitude and radical dress made her a topic of conversation throughout Washington. Perhaps the people that Mary impressed the most, though, were the wives of generals and the wives of politicians, and they pressed their husbands to agree to Mary's requests. She did receive the support of General Thomas, who appointed her as an Army assistant surgeon, and even General Sherman supported her. This was Mary's comments before she died. "I have got to die before people will know who I am and what I have done. It is a shame that people who lead reforms in this world are not appreciated until after they are dead. Then the world pays tributes by piling rocks over the grave of the reformer." Mary Walker. Mary lived her life in the moment and never stopped her tireless efforts to create equality and civil rights for women. As eccentric as she was also a seer of women's dress reform, of women's social equality, of women's suffrage, and of women's destinies. Thank you. Go back to go back to that picture of Mary, the one just before this, the one in tails. The one picture I could not obtain from the historical association in Oswego. Mary dressed like this. She wanted to see what she would look like in her coffin, so they have a picture of her. She's lying in her coffin. She's smiling. She's got her Medal of Honor, wearing a scarf. But they wouldn't let me reproduce that picture. So now you know. Now if you go to websites, Medal of Honor web, not the official, the government official Medal of Honor website, but if you go to unofficial Medal of Honor websites, you often will not find Mary's name there. So whoever maintains an unofficial Medal of Honor site has excluded certain peoples. So now you know the only woman who has been awarded the Medal of Honor. And that's a pretty good bet if you you want to bet someone, one of your friends, or you may be able to pull it off. Any questions? Thank you. Now, next week, I'll give you the. We'll talk about the death of Stonewall Jackson and the death of Joshua Chamberlain. Two men who, in many respects, are similar, but have significant differences. Both men having been wounded, and the wounding and the outcome of that wound have profound effects for both the Confederate Army and the Union Army. And I'll have an amputation kit available next week if anyone wants to see what an amputation kit looks like. No demonstrations. Well, we could do something, but there's a book up front here with some envelopes in it that I've collected over the years of first day of issue of Mary Walker's stamp. Yeah, thank you. I wish I could have made the others. Well, they've been recorded. Yeah, they're on the center. Yeah, the YouTube site for the center. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I was playing pickleball, and we had 3 nurses. One of them was a surgical nurse. We all retired. And I said, well, if somebody gets injured, we can do surgery on the court.
Okay. Good to see you, Cliff. Oh, that's when that's how I meant. That was the Medal of Honor design for that period. And then the other, yeah, and it's been modified again. So there've been the Medal of Honor has gone 3 modifications. Yeah, that was the time frame of the modification. Oh yeah, I'm the president of it. Our next meeting is they're open to the public. Our next meeting, we meet on the 3rd Thursday of the month. So it's I believe it's next at the Civic Club. Meeting starts at 7:00. Our speaker is Bob Grasser, who's the editor of the newsletter for the Raleigh Civil War Roundtable, and he has a particular interest in railroads. So he's going to be talking about the significance of railroads in the Civil War. Most of our January and February, because you never know what weather's going to be like down here. You know, if there are 4 snowflakes, they may close the highways, things like that. So we'll draw on our own members or local individuals, but most of our other speakers are nationally recognized historians or authors. Yep. Sure. You were. Don't feel bad about that.
No, I just thought I'd tell you Ben would get married.
Okay. Well, I was born in Utica.
You were?
Yeah.
What?
Mohawk. doesn't exist anymore.
No, mine doesn't either. We're so old, the buildings are gone.
How long were you in Utica? Oh, okay.
But my
But we're born 42. Who's that? I didn't know him. Well, you're younger than me. That's all. I'll tell you, if you were born in Utica and then lived in Rome, and if you like Italian sausage, you probably ate my family's Italian sausage. But yeah, that was the family business. And the Wednesday truck route was to Rome and Sylvan Beach. And we had many customers. Sickles restaurant in Rome. And what's the Sickles further down the road? When you come into Rome, that first big Italian restaurant on the right near the creek. Savoy. Yeah.
couldn't
Yeah.
go without eating
Yeah,
there.
that's right. They were our regular customers. Okay. Oh, Utica was also in this week's Spotlight. You read the article on the 125th anniversary of the Southern Pines Fire Department. They have a picture of their first fire truck, Old Betsy. It says in the article that Old Betsy was shipped from Utica, New York.
Where is that?
It's in the Pilot, the local newspaper.
Oh, I can look
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Read
Thank you.
the article about yeah. It's got a picture of the first fire truck, Old Betsy, and when you read the article, it says it was shipped, I think, in 1927 from Utica, New York.
Wow. I'm famous.
Yeah. That's right. Thank you. Yeah. This was the fourth one I've given. There'll be two more. One. Oh yeah. No, I don't have but they're being recorded. So if you go to the Lynn can give you the information. You go on YouTube on your computer. You can actually, if you missed any of the earlier ones, you can watch them on your computer. No. Oh, well, what's coming up next Friday will be Jackson and Joshua Chamberlain, and then the one after that, I'm doing a total of 6. So this is number 4. Yeah. So it'll be the next 2 Fridays, right? The last one will be it's the Orphans of Gettysburg. It's the story of an unidentified soldier who is identified, and he has a picture of his 3 children that he's holding in his hand when his body's found. And from that, they're able to eventually identify him, and it's what happens to the 3 children, which brings it right up to today, actually. Thank you. What? Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Okay.
And I kept saying it, he never looked at me. I was trying to like, Joshua.
Of Lee. Yeah.
But sitting on that horse.
Yeah, you're right.
And they have a horse that was very nice. Yeah. And there was a little girl, she was 8 years old, and it was her family that had the horse. And she was on there, she said, "How was your dear dad today? So don't be She was adorable. She was dressed like a little girl had been in the 1860s and all, with her little hair.
I just wanted to bring up by sheer coincidence, this morning I ran across, was watching on YouTube something, doing their shit, and one of the real managers a picture of that. Was a woman, she depicted someone called Captain Sally.
Yeah, Tompkins. Yeah.
He's
She-
brilliant.
Tompkins was a woman who disguised herself as a man,
Yeah.
and she serves on the staff. So she's a messenger. She's a spy. Uh, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, and that woman was, but she was